Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking tonight about dyslexia. It's a learning disability. It's the most common of all learning disabilities. And speaking of learning, I have learned so much about it this week as I've been preparing and thinking about it. And it's a much tougher thing to deal with than I had realized. So I hope if you don't know much about it, you can stick with us for the half hour. I think you'll learn a lot. I wanted to just say how common it is before I turn it over to our guests. Up to 20% of the population has some degree of dyslexia. And I want to ask them about the continuum or the gradation of symptoms, but that's a lot of us. And we're talking tonight about developmental dyslexia, so it's going to be a packed half hour. My guests, I'll introduce you first to Rachel Berger. She is the mother of a young 13-year-old boy, who has dyslexia or deals with it. She's become an advocate. She formed a grassroots organization called Decoding Dyslexia. She's gone to the legislators and pushed for more equity and changes in our educational system. So we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. And then our second guest, Jim Bauer, an old friend who has written at least three books, about having dyslexia. And the one that I really dove into this week is called The Runaway Train, or The Runaway Learning Machine. I used an old saying, didn't I? The Runaway Learning Machine, Growing Up Dyslexic. And I was so charmed by the book in a sense that I felt like I was inside the mind and the body of a young boy growing up, and it gave me so much understanding. So we'll talk more about Jim's experiences in a minute too. Well, thank you both for being here.
Thank you for
Thanks for
asking.
having us.
Sharing some stories and ideas for our culture. I think there's lots of work to do, isn't there?
There
In
is.
terms of what's going on. First of all, I think we need to define it. I don't know which one of you wants to take that. Do you want to, Jim?
Well, probably the best way of looking at it, it's the inability to master English language, reading, writing, and spelling, despite having a high IQ or an above average IQ. You cannot be dyslexic and be below normal as far as an IQ. So there is the dilemma. And I kind of phrase that as the dyslexic imposter complex, that many people, young and adults, have evidence that they're quite intelligent, but this other, that they think that there's something dreadfully wrong with them and that they are really stupid. And these fight with each other internally.
And some kids and grown-ups have trouble with math too, don't they, when they are dyslexic?
Well, yes.
It's called dyscalculia.
It can be a separate, but very often these things can be connected.
And what about the connection too with hyperactivity? And is there a big connection in that regard?
Well, frequently people will go, when they see their child struggling, they'll go to their pediatrician. And the pediatrician may not know the signs or symptoms of dyslexia. And so the child may have, behavior as a side effect, not behavior as the cause as to why they're not doing well in school.
That
and so
makes sense,
it
Rachel.
is common for a child who has dyslexia to have an ADHD diagnosis. And sometimes they do go hand in hand, and a certain percent of dyslexics can also have that. But it is common for a child to have a misdiagnosis of ADHD when peeling back the onion skin, it's a learning disability that's unidentified and unsupported.
That makes so much sense, doesn't it? You're frustrated, you want to get attention for something, and you're not getting it in the traditional ways. Yeah. What is the cause, or do we know the cause?
So there isn't, and Jim, jump in if you want to, but there isn't a cause of dyslexia. It's neurobiological in origin, and so it's genetic. You're born with it.
It's the way the brain is wired,
It's the way the brain is wired.
Speak.
Absolutely. And so it's genetic and it's passed down, but it doesn't mean that, say, if you have someone in your family with it, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a child with it, but it is heritable. And there are things that can make, there are things that can, factors, I suppose, that can make it more prevalent. Say, for instance, if you have a child who's had many frequent ear infections, because you have the vestibular and proprioceptive areas of the brain that are responsible for taking in language and developing language, that can be something that in turn makes it more difficult to process language. And so that can be a characteristic that when you're learning speech and hearing can contribute to it, as in the case of my son.
But also, dyslexic people learn differently. And for instance, there's different types of learning, because of visual, auditory. There's even a vestibular learning that some people have to be moving to learn. And you're more successful tutoring.
Moving as in not just sitting still at a desk.
Right. And so you may see like a kid at the back of the room
Or pacing.
may very possibly be your vestibular learning. Your vestibular learner, and to make that person sit down and not move, you just eliminated one of their learning styles.
Oh, so that would make it much harder to learn.
And that, I think, shows that certain tutoring programs that, for myself, Orton-Gillingham approach, which is a multisensory approach, took me from a non-reader as a young adult to college level, because they use all your senses to learn.
That was an exciting chapter when I read about that tutor you had. That was great.
When the English language starts to make sense, the light bulb starts to come on. Maybe you're not as dumb as you really think you are.
It's almost like a rebirth, I bet, Jim, for the child or a young adult. I want to go back and just talk a little bit more about what we might call symptoms. That might not even be the right word, but what are things that go along with dyslexia that parents could say, oh my goodness, I maybe need to get my child some extra help here?
Sure. So I'm going to look at the elementary segment and speak to that. And maybe, Jim, you might want to take the older side, since you discovered it when you were older, or either or. So some of the things common in young students at kindergarten to third grade is their inability to understand sounds and sound symbols and understand phonetics. So they may have struggles with rhyming words. They may have struggles hearing something you said and being able to repeat it back to you. They may have trouble with directionality, like understanding left from right, or if you say things like, "Can you stand in line behind Johnny," or something. So that whole directionality piece. Trouble, tying shoes, spelling. Trouble learning to read despite effective classroom instruction, and that's again where Jim had said earlier. Again, a child with high, average to above average IQ, but struggling to be able to learn to read like their peers. And so those are some of just the basic early indicators.
So when you say struggling to read, as you described it in your book, I mean, you really almost would say you couldn't read as a first, second, third grader, could you?
No, from first, second, third grade, you learn to read. After that, you read to learn. And if you don't have that skill underneath your belt, you're going to be spending the rest of those years trying to catch a runaway learning machine.
And therefore the title of your book.
And
Yeah.
when you look at your older student or even your adult starting to develop avoidance behaviors around reading, writing, and spelling. And for instance, the older student becoming Mr. Trouble, Mr. Clown, or Mr. Ghost.
Right.
You know, being the kid that's warming the seat outside the principal's office, causing trouble,
Making friends with the janitor.
making friends, the
Right.
clown, the class clown, or the kid that just sits there and just wants to be invisible.
Which is kind of where you were as a young boy.
Yeah, wanted to be Mr. Ghost, Mr. Invisible. But you may see this in the workplace too. The individual that avoids reading. And for instance, when someone gets into a professional relationship, for instance, like with a social worker, and perhaps they're recommended they read a particular book, and they come back the next week, they haven't done it. Well,
But a good excuse, maybe.
good excuse. They, you know, and the therapist may even go, well, not motivated, or the person that won't fill out a form, it fills out a form, just, you know, those are avoidance type situations. Or let's say you're in a workplace and it looks like a school situation, and you'll notice that that one particular person sabotages the class. Now, why would they do that? They don't want to be called upon to read because it's become such an embarrassment to them. They'll do anything to get out of it.
Well, as you described your feelings as a little boy, I mean, you would almost get physically sick, hoping the teacher wouldn't call on him, fearful, you know, of what might happen in the classroom, and fearful you were going to lose friends, which you did, because they thought you were dumb.
That's right.
It just sounded
Dyslexia,
so hard.
for many people, can be a very lonely place.
Very lonely.
Because when you have a secret, you'll keep relationships at a distance. You don't want anybody to know. So you become very much a loner.
Is that something your son has had to struggle with, or have you been able to intervene, Rachel, in a way that...
Yeah. So thankfully for us, my son doesn't know the struggles that Jim faced, or the what he shared in his book, The Runaway Learning Machine, or actually the struggles that, because it's hereditary, my brothers and my father faced. We had him diagnosed at age 5, so we knew at 5 years old what he needed. And at this stage of the game, it's known that a dyslexic student needs very specific, explicit instruction. And so we didn't wait. We knew that our schools were not set up to handle the type of specific remediation he needed, and we sought that out privately. And so he has not ever known a struggle to read.
But it's still harder than average then?
Sure, because dyslexia is, you know, there are many things that go with it. You can have, as you mentioned before, the math portion of it, and you can have dysgraphia, which is the writing portion of it. And so, you know, a lot of times we talk about dyslexic as they have these gifts. Well, my son hit the triple lottery with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, and he's still waiting to find the gift in it, because every day at school is difficult, though he can read. So he can't, you know, again, he didn't experience it in the way that Jim did, and thankfully we know better and we're able to do more than when Jim was in school. But it's still difficult, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yes, I'm learning that. One big question, and I just want to have you respond to it before we move on. Is there a real continuum in terms of the severity of dealing with it? I'm guessing the answer is yes, but what's your answer?
Yes, because more and more demands are put upon your reading. Like I said, that you learn to read for the first 3 years, and then you need to read to learn. And then if you hit college, it's even more so.
But are there some kids, Jim, who are born in a way that it's going to just be a lot harder for them from the get-go than other people who might have what I might call a mild level
So
of
there are
dyslexia?
Certainly, yes.
severities ranging in mild to profound.
Okay, that's what I wondered,
Yes.
yeah.
And those who have profound dyslexia will have a lot of struggle learning to master
Even if
reading,
there's
even if they're
intervention.
provided the correct intervention. It might take them
Okay.
longer.
Okay.
Whereas, you know, again, my son, as an example, a very mild case, was provided the right instruction and really kind of flew through that.
The school system that you land in or are in is a huge variable too, isn't it? I mean, you were told
Yeah.
you're not trying hard enough. Try harder.
Try harder, try harder.
Try harder.
And my parents were also told that I was a slow learner, which is a category between the bottom of normal and the top of essentially retarded. And I was never formally evaluated, but they gave me that label. And I think everyone believed it, including myself for a while.
Yeah. And your parents didn't understand, did they? I mean, they were hard on you, I would say.
They were hard on me, and well, they're the parents that came out of the Depression and World War II, and they didn't have much of an education, and they thought whoever had education, teachers, particularly if you were clergy nuns, they were right. Even if they thought they were wrong, they were right.
Do you think the parochial educational system dealt more poorly with this kind of a child with dyslexia or other learning disabilities than other schools, or across the board was it a bad situation?
I think in those days it was a bad situation.
No matter where you ended up.
And shortly prior to that, so my grandfather, who I sometimes wonder had dyslexia, ended school at 8th grade.
Which was pretty common for other reasons too, though, right?
But he went out and he worked with a plumber, and the plumber said, "Don't sit down, kid, do what I do, watch what I do." And so the plumber taught multi-sensory. My grandfather became a plumber.
Ah,
Then he went on,
what a wise plumber, huh?
Then he went on, he was in the state legislature.
Oh, interesting, wow.
And, but, we used to teach multi-sensory. If you weren't getting it in the 8 years or 6 years, whatever they did, then you were expected to go out and work with someone who taught multi-sensory, what your career was going to be.
Wow. Well, we have only 10 minutes left. I want to ask you both what you think we need to be doing in our culture to make it easier for young people who are maybe 5, 6 years old and just on the, beginning ladder steps of education and onward. But what has to change in our schools right now, do you think?
There's a lot of things that need to change, and that's why my nonprofit exists, in large part. Why we got to start was to ensure that all kids have equitable access to lessons in literacy to, achieve their full educational outcomes. But it starts with ensuring that our educators are prepared to instruct based upon the science of reading.
So going back to their college and graduate school training.
Right. And then also being able to early identify, because as you had mentioned earlier when we were talking about my son, the earlier you can identify a child's specific needs around dyslexia, the earlier you can intervene and ensure that they're making grade level reading proficiency and on track, versus waiting until they are too far behind, or like Jim said, that 3rd grade, once your peers have moved on to reading to learn, it becomes very difficult to keep up. And in fact, if a kid isn't identified until 3rd grade, they stand less than a 17% chance of ever catching up to their peers. And so they can potentially spend the rest of their academic years in special education. So it starts with ensuring that our educators are prepared to teach the science of reading. It moves on to also ensuring that they can identify and match children to the appropriate service.
So are there good assessment tools and tests that are used all over the United States to identify these children?
Well, they are there, but I can't say how uniformly they're used. But I really agree upon the early intervention. But the intervention also depends on parents involvement is
Right,
very,
right.
very important.
They've got to understand.
And it has to be, you have to look at your own baggage before you go in to advocate for your child. Because if this runs in families, you don't want to see your child go through what you want to go through. So you have to take a step back, look at your own baggage, and don't go in guns a-blazing.
Guns a-blazing is, drawing lines across the table and creating that adversarial relationship is no way to start advocating for a child's education.
A lot of teachers that I know personally have left teaching because they're overwhelmed with all the needs of the kids. And are there ways in some of the really great schools you know of that has made it easier for teachers to handle these children who have huge needs?
So one of the things that we've been fortunate to do as a nonprofit in the last couple of years is to pass a bill that created a dyslexia specialist at our Department of Education. And she's out there in the field working with school districts and schools. And so she is now doing a specific set of training with educators around the state, and it's called LETRS, so Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Science. And she's finding that the more that teachers have the tools and are prepared to work with their students, it definitely is creating a better feeling, because a lot of the teachers that we know and that we work with in our advocacy group tell us that one of the most important things for them is that their children are succeeding in reading, and we weigh a lot of that when we think about state testing. We're looking at the reading and math scores, and so that's really impactful to them.
I would think it'd be exciting for them too to understand and then realize, oh, this child is not being rebellious or
And it's not the
bored.
teachers, it's not the educators' fault either, because they are providing instruction that's working for majority, and it's not
that's
something.
a good way to
It's not,
also not put shame or blame on that whole group.
I've never met an educator that doesn't want their children to succeed and doesn't want the tools to.
Yeah,
And I never met a child that didn't want to succeed.
right.
And so, but we have to make sure that our teachers have the right ammunition as well. That they have to fall back on their training, and if they haven't gotten the appropriate training, we need to get it for them.
So the teachers need more training, the parents need more awareness building and education, and the kids are going to really benefit.
And the kids can also do their own advocacy. They, at
Yeah, I
appropriate
suppose
age
at a
level
certain-
and understanding of their own dyslexia.
And maybe avoid some of the really hard emotions and stress
The
that
negative self-talk,
is horrible.
and even other classmates, if they understand what's going on with my friend,
Right.
oh, no big deal, let's go shoot baskets.
I thought, I have a 12-year-old grandson, and I thought, I really want him to read your book because I think that would give him a lot of empathy
Insight.
for some kids maybe he goes to school with. I want to hold up Jim's books, and I want to give Rachel's website to you. I guess we'll do the books first. So the book that I read and was excited about sharing with you, The Runaway Learning Machine, not train. And as I said, this is the story that Jim's really early and up to his grown-up days
Young
goes
adulthood.
into.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because we really see inside the mind of a child such a neat way. And then the next two books, this one is it says self-help resource for adolescents and adults, Too Much Time on Sycamore Street. I'll let you do a close-up of this.
It's written from one dyslexic person to another.
I haven't read this yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And then the third book is Do You Know How to Pick Berries? A novel about Down syndrome and dyslexia in the 60s. So all kinds of reading options here. And Jim, you said you're between publishers right now.
Yeah.
So people can get a book or books by writing to your email address.
Yeah, right to my email, and then if they can give me their address, I'll send them out, and it's a honors program, so I will tell you what you owe, and you can send me.
So give us your email address.
RUNLRNMCHN @AOL.com.
And we'll put that on the screen.
Oh, thank you.
And then we got a minute left. We want to plug your website,
Sure.
which is www.decodingdyslexiamn.org.
Yep. A lot of great resources for parents, educators, and interested professionals.
When it says MN like that, are there parallel kind of groups in other states?
Oh, so that's a good question.
I wonder.
So Decoding Dyslexia is a national grassroots movement. There is a state in every, or there's a chapter in every state
okay, good.
in North America currently.
Okay, good.
And yeah, so.
That's great to know. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. I hope you've learned. I know I have, and I appreciate so much just getting to understand this big issue much better. So thank you for coming
thank you
down,
for having
Rachel.
us.
Thank you, Mary.
Jim. It's great to have you both here. Thank you for joining us. I'll be back again next week. Check out these books and these and Rachel's website, and I think you'll be glad you did. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.